Well, we're here at Weston, Southampton Water on the 9th of August, Friday, in the afternoon. Wind is about 20 mph, gusting to 30. We're waiting for the tide to come in, and meanwhile Dick is contemplating the ease with which he could launch Woodstock. The beach here is very flat until it gets up to the edge, so he'd have to walk out a long way to get into deep water, and we need about 3.5 feet deep to launch the boat because of the deep keel. So the three things we want to test out are the deeper rudder, where you can see we've added a bit on the bottom, the fact that we've raked the keel aft, it was vertical before, and these new sails which were made for us by Roger. They're slightly more rigid than the ones we had before. Right, we're all set up to launch.
Yeah.
There's Dick.
So Friday the 9th.
I've done all
that bit, right?
And we've got a spot reporter on here as well, just in case we lose the boat. At least we'll find out out of radio control, out of the LoRa range. We'll find out what's going to happen then. I don't know how far out Dick has to go to get to 3 feet or 3.5 feet deep. Of course, the sails exert quite a lot of force, so he's likely to get blown over if we're not careful. Oh, well that went fine, and I expected it to go on a tack 268, which is where it's going. The wind is southerly. So here we are, tacking on 268, almost into the sun, and it seems to be going absolutely fine. It will get to the end of its green corridor in a minute, and then it should go on to the other tack, if it can turn. I think it's turned, so it's coming back on the other tack, which is absolutely wonderful. We're on 135 now, and it's getting to the edge of the green corridor, so it should turn. There it is, turning and going back. It turned without any trouble. It's going back on the other tack. So far this is going absolutely brilliantly. The mission we normally sail at Weston is this circle, which we originally set up so that we could get a polar diagram for the boat. But the problem with this mission is it's got an awful lot of waypoints in it, and they're very close together, less than 50 metres apart, and that doesn't give the autopilot much chance to get weaving on its algorithms. So we decided to simplify the mission down to a pentagon, as shown here, where the distance between waypoints is more like 120 metres. So Dick walked it out quite a long way into the sea because the tide wasn't at high tide, and then he let it go. And it tacked successfully all the way to P1 without human intervention, which is an improvement on what happened last time. And then it tacked okay nearly to P2, but at this point it's a bit tied up going backwards and forwards over the same course. So I decided to intervene with little radio control to get it to P2, and then it tacked to P3 going directly into the wind. Made a bit of an excursion there, as you can see, and then it got tied up again going backwards and forwards, and I again intervened with radio control to get it to P3. These are the radio control shown by the magenta. Then it sailed fast and straight to P4 and to P5 and to P6, and then it sailed directly downwind in a slightly snaking track back to base. So Woodstock did quite well and better than last time, but there were some anomalies. It got held up there, and I had to use radio control. And it went on a long excursion there, and it snaked when sailing downwind. So we need to look at those. So it's tacking on 141 and travelling at about 1.9 knots. And it should shortly do an auto jibe to get onto the other tack. And it seems to be going pretty well. I think there it goes now. See, that's a smooth jibe, and off it goes on the other tack. If we look at this bit here where it got locked into going backwards and forwards on basically the same line, if I reverse that back to there, we're tacking across the corridor, and at this point we decide that we could sail directly from here to P2. So the navigator establishes a course of 149. But we're still pointing over to the north west. So it tries to turn by applying full port rudder. It tries to turn through the wind but fails, and then it does an auto jibe, and eventually it manages to turn itself round here. So it's now pointing on the course that we want it to be on. But by that time it has drifted further north and across the green corridor, and it then sails downwards in the southeasterly direction for a while, still thinking it can sail directly to P2, but at a certain point it decides here that it cannot sail directly to P2, so it resumes tacking, and here we have a bug in the software. When it resumed tacking, what it should have done is tacked on this beat going down to the southeast, but instead it decides to resume the 286 tack, the one it was on before. And it does this because this 286 tacking direction is locked. If I wind this back a bit again, it's tacking across here, and that tacking direction of 286 is locked until it tacks across this green line. You may say, well, it actually did go across the green line, so why didn't it unlock it? Well, it did go across the green line, but when it went across the green line, it was not tacking. And that is the bug. It should always unlock the tacking direction when it goes across the green line, even if it isn't tacking at the time it goes across that green line. So on the 17th of January this year at Bray Lake, we were tacking from Alpha to Bravo, and we're supposed to be sticking between these two green lines. And it went fine for a while. That's all absolutely fine. And then at this point here, it decided that it could sail directly to Bravo. And then it changed its mind a bit later, and instead of continuing to tack up there, it tacked down that way. So that's why we put the lock in, to stop it abandoning a tack halfway along. But I just didn't code it properly. So that's basically why it kept getting stuck going backwards and forwards in this line. I fixed that problem now. But another interesting thing about this was that I eventually decided to radio control it at this point here. I switched radio control on as shown by the magenta, and all I did was leave the joystick alone, so the effect of the radio control was to keep the rudder central, as shown by this very low PWM signal here, despite the fact that the autopilot has still got full starboard rudder. And the boat sailed with a completely centralised rudder nicely to P2. If anything, at a slightly a closer angle to the wind than it was when it was tacking here. So this is another case where perhaps the helmsman could be less active and still achieve a satisfactory result, rather than constantly struggling with the helm in an attempt to keep the boat pointing in exactly the same direction. It could just centralise the rudder and let it sail naturally in a more or less straight line. When tacking from P2 to P3, we were more or less tacking directly upwind, and it went okay, but we had increasing difficulty at the northern end of each beat in jibing onto the other beat. This one here eventually succeeded, but we lost a fair bit of ground. And then the next one was really bad. Auto jibe. Now we're just continuing with full starboard rudder, trying to turn away from the wind, still pointing on a heading of 316, and the speed is over 2 mph, so the boat still doesn't have enough rudder to turn away from the wind in that situation. Eventually, by chance, I know not exactly how or why, it did manage to turn there, and then it came all the way back. But by that time it had lost a bit of ground, and so we got back into this wasting our time going backwards and forwards along the same line. And this again is the same bug that I mentioned before, and with the same solution. I just applied radio control and left the rudder central, and it happily went to P3 without the assistance of any clever helmsman. The reason, by the way, that I took radio control was that Dick was spending most of his time talking to members of the public who insist on coming up and asking us what we're doing. And whilst we don't mind that, it does rather distract us from the investigations we're supposed to be doing.
So it's at P4, going to P5. It's going from P5 to P6. No tacking required. What's the speed? 1.3 mph. So now it's sailing downwind from P6 back to base. Directly downwind, and it's actually snaking.
That's what it's doing.
It's snaking left and right. So this is direct downwind. Or is it pirouetting?
No, it's just...
It's just snaking.
Yeah. Not that good really, because we've been doing quite a lot of downwind.
So it's snaking. We'll have to look at why that is.
Probably in a real sailing boat, one would let the mainsail go out to a wider angle
or put up a spinnaker, but because we can't adjust the sails, we're more or less stuck with this snaking action when sailing downwind. Well, at the end of the test we did what we always do, which is to take the deck off the hull and see how much water there is inside. And we were so flabbergasted by the result that I'm afraid we forgot to film it. So when we took the deck off like this, we discovered there was water in here. There's water in the bottom of the mast step here and in this compartment. And I realised to my horror that I'd forgotten to put the plug in the bottom of this tube where the mast goes. This plug should be in there. And I'd completely forgotten about it. So there was nothing stopping water sloshing over the deck, going down this tube, except for the fact that the mast fits fairly tightly in there. On the other hand, the good news is that there was no water anywhere else. Normally there's water, a little bit of water in this central compartment here, but there wasn't any water in that, and there wasn't any water in this or in the one in the bow. So we may be all right so long as I remember to actually put that plug in the bottom of the mast tube. What about the raking of the keel? Did that make any difference? Well, in the previous test in March, under very similar wind and wave conditions, the average pitch angle for the whole test was 1.97 degrees bow down, whereas with this current test, the average pitch angle was 0.99 degrees bow down. So the raking of the keel has improved the bow down attitude of the boat, but there is some scope for raking it a bit more. Well, that's all for now. I'm still working on solar panels, and in the medium term we're hoping to do a bigger test in the English Channel, maybe say from Boscombe towards Weymouth, so that we can see how Woodstock handles the tidal currents. But in the meantime, thanks very much for watching.